The gentle lull of the sea had always brought Aurora a strange sense of peace. As a child, she would run along the sandy shores, her feet barely touching the ground as she chased the tides, laughing with a kind of unbridled joy only children know. Those were simpler times, times when the world was a place full of promise and everything made sense. Now, as she stood on the same shoreline, the familiar sound of the waves crashing against the rocks did little to ease the storm raging within her heart. The salty wind whipped through her hair, tossing it in all directions as she stared out at the endless expanse of ocean. The horizon seemed so far away, unreachable, just like the life she had left behind. Aurora's mind raced back to the events that had brought her here, to this small coastal town that had once been her family's summer escape, but now felt more like a self-imposed exile. Her heart ached as she thought about the choices she had made. Choices that had cost her the approval and love of her family, the life of luxury she had grown up with, and everything she had ever known. But amidst the pain, there was one thing she could not regret: Miguel. Her thoughts turned to him, the fisherman whose life was so different from her own. Miguel had been nothing more than a stranger when they first met, a man of the sea who lived a simple, unassuming life. But over time, he had become so much more. He was her anchor, the one constant in her world of uncertainty. And as their love grew, so too did the distance between Aurora and her family. Her father had always been a man of strong opinions, a proud businessman who believed in tradition and status. To him, Aurora had always been the daughter meant to carry on the family legacy, to marry well, and to live a life that reflected the family's wealth and power. But when she fell in love with Miguel, a man with calloused hands and humble roots, everything changed. Her father's words still rang in her ears, even now, weeks after their last argument. "You are throwing your life away for a fisherman? A man who can offer you nothing? You will come to regret this decision, Aurora. Mark my words." Those words had cut her deeply, and she had left that night without looking back. She couldn't stay and endure the constant disapproval, the judgment, the feeling that she was no longer enough for the family that had raised her. Yet as she stood there now, looking out at the same ocean Miguel called home, Aurora couldn't help but wonder if her father had been right. Had she really thrown her life away for love? Was this all some grand mistake? Her heart clenched with uncertainty, and for a moment, she felt a pang of fear. What if Miguel wasn't enough? What if this life she had chosen wasn't enough? But as if summoned by her thoughts, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Miguel's presence was like a warm breeze, calming her restless soul even before he spoke. "Aurora," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of concern. "You've been out here for a while." She nodded, still staring out at the water. "I needed some air." Miguel moved beside her, his dark eyes searching her face. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin tanned from years of working under the sun. His hands, though rough and calloused, were always gentle when they touched her, a stark contrast to the harshness of his life. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed in worry. Aurora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She wanted to tell him everything, the doubts, the fears, the way her family's words still haunted her. But as she looked into his eyes, so full of love and trust, she couldn't bring herself to burden him with her inner turmoil. "I'm fine," she lied, offering him a small smile. Miguel didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently brushing against her knuckles. "You know," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I may not have much to offer you. I don't come from wealth, and I can't give you the kind of life you were used to. But I can promise you this: I'll always be here for you. I'll love you with everything I have, even if that's not much." Aurora's heart swelled with emotion at his words. He was so sincere, so genuine, and she knew that he meant every word. Miguel had never been one for grand gestures or flowery declarations of love, but his quiet devotion was more than enough for her. "I don't care about wealth," Aurora said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't care about any of that. I chose you because I love you, Miguel. You are my world. The weight of those words seemed to settle between them, and for a moment, there was only silence. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the space, but it was a comforting sound now, not a reminder of her doubts. Miguel smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. He reached up and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I love you too, Aurora," he whispered, leaning in to press a soft kiss to her lips. The kiss was sweet and tender, full of all the love and affection that words couldn't express. As Miguel's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, Aurora felt the last of her doubts melt away. This was where she belonged, here, in his arms by the sea. This was her home now. Days turned into weeks, and Aurora found herself settling into her new life with Miguel. The small coastal town, once a place of refuge, had now become her home. She had grown to love the simplicity of it. The early mornings spent watching the sunrise over the water, the quiet afternoons spent tending to the small garden Miguel had helped her plant, and the peaceful evenings they shared together, watching the stars from the porch of their modest house. Aurora had never known such contentment. For the first time in her life, she felt free from the expectations of her family, free from the pressure to be someone she wasn't. Here in this small town, she could just be Aurora, the woman who loved a fisherman. But as much as she tried to embrace her new life, there was always a part of her that felt incomplete. It was the part of her that longed for her family's acceptance, for their understanding. She hadn't spoken to them since the night she left, and though she tried to push the thoughts of them away, they always lingered at the back of her mind. She missed her mother's gentle touch, her father's stern but loving advice. She missed the laughter of family dinners and the warmth of her childhood home. But most of all, she missed feeling like she belonged with them. It wasn't long before those feelings of longing and regret began to creep into her dreams. Night after night, Aurora found herself dreaming of her family, of her father's disapproving scowl, her mother's tearful eyes, and the empty seat at the dinner table where she used to sit. In her dreams, she was always running toward them, but no matter how fast she ran, she could never quite reach them. The dreams left her feeling unsettled, and soon, they began to affect her waking life as well. She became distant, lost in her own thoughts as she went about her daily routines. Miguel noticed, of course, but every time he asked her what was wrong, she brushed him off with a forced smile. "I'm fine," she would say. "Just tired." But Miguel wasn't fooled. He knew her too well, and one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, he finally confronted her. "Aurora," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I know something's been bothering you. You haven't been yourself lately." Aurora sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. She didn't want to lie to him anymore, but the truth was hard to face. "I've been thinking about my family," she admitted softly. "I miss them." Miguel was silent for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders in a comforting embrace. "Do you regret leaving them?" he asked quietly. Aurora shook her head. "No, I don't regret choosing you, Miguel. I could never regret that. But I wish things were different. I wish they could accept us." Miguel nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out at the horizon. "I know. I wish that too." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Finally, Miguel spoke again. "Maybe it's time to reach out to them," he suggested. "Maybe they're ready to listen now." Aurora's heart clenched at the thought. She had considered reaching out to her family many times, but fear had always held her back. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of reopening old wounds. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if they don't want to hear from me?" Miguel turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "You won't know unless you try." Aurora stared at him, her mind racing. He was right, of course. She couldn't keep running from her past forever. If she ever wanted peace, she had to face it head on. Taking it deep, it had been days since Aurora first met Miguel, and yet every moment she spent alone, her mind wandered back to that stormy night on the beach. The image of him soaked, but resolute and kind, etched itself into her thoughts. There was something about the man that was different from anyone she had ever met before. Despite his humble appearance, he radiated a quiet strength, an authenticity she had never encountered in the polished, insincere men in her life. Her father had always surrounded their family with men of power, influence, and wealth, none of whom had ever made her heart stir the way Miguel had in such a short encounter. Aurora tried to push the thoughts aside. She told herself it was nothing more than a passing curiosity. After all, how could she, an heiress to a vast fortune, groomed to be the perfect socialite, possibly be thinking about a fisherman? The disparity between their worlds was glaringly obvious, and yet, the more she fought against the thoughts, the stronger they became. She had grown tired of the empty conversations and superficial smiles of high society. Perhaps it was that weariness that made Miguel seem so alluring. There was no pretension in him, no hidden agenda. He had looked at her as though she were not just another wealthy girl in a gilded cage, but something more, someone worth knowing. For Miguel, the days following that fateful encounter were equally unsettling. He had never expected to cross paths with someone like Aurora, a woman whose beauty was only matched by the quiet sadness in her eyes. He couldn't shake the image of her standing on the porch of her family's estate, the storm casting shadows on her delicate features. Her presence had been like a dream, something fleeting and unattainable, but real enough to leave an indelible mark on his heart. Miguel had always been a man of simple means. His life was measured by the tides, the fish he caught, and the sun setting over the horizon. It was a life of hard work, but also of peace. A life he had long come to accept with gratitude. He never imagined that someone like Aurora could even exist in his world, let alone captivate him the way she did. Every time he cast his nets into the water, he wondered if he'd ever see her again. It was a futile hope, he knew. Their worlds were too far apart, but still, he couldn't help but hope for a miracle. And then, as if the universe had heard his silent wish, it happened. Aurora, unable to resist the pull she felt towards Miguel, found herself wandering back to the beach where they had first met. She told herself it was just for some fresh air, a walk along the shore to clear her mind. But deep down, she knew she was hoping to see him again. Her heart beat faster with every step she took, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of him. Yes, she rounded a bend in the coastline. There he was. Miguel stood by his boat, repairing a torn sail, his strong hands working with practiced precision. The sight of him made her heart skip a beat. She paused for a moment, unsure of whether to approach him or turn back. But then, as if sensing her presence, Miguel looked up. Their eyes met, and in that instant, all of Aurora's doubts faded away. She smiled, and he smiled back, a warmth spreading through her chest. Miguel straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth before walking towards her. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but also something else, something that mirrored the emotions swirling inside her. "Miss Aurora," he greeted her, his voice calm, but laced with an underlying tension. "I didn't expect to see you here again." Aurora blushed, feeling a little embarrassed by how her presence might seem. She had no real reason to be there, other than the inexplicable draw she felt towards him. "I was just taking a walk," she said, glancing down at the sand, feeling the weight of her words. "It's a beautiful day." Miguel nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "It is," he agreed, though his gaze made it clear that he was speaking about more than just the weather. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the space between them. It was a silence that was neither uncomfortable nor awkward, but rather charged with an unspoken understanding. Miguel broke the silence first. "I was just fixing my sail. The storm the other night did a number on it." "I'm sorry to hear that," Aurora said, stepping closer to him. "Do you often have to deal with things like that?" Miguel chuckled softly, a sound that made her stomach flutter. "It comes with the job. You learn to live with it." Aurora found herself fascinated by him, by the simplicity of his life, and the way he seemed so at peace with it. She had never met anyone who accepted their circumstances so gracefully. In her world, people were constantly striving for more, never satisfied with what they had. But here was Miguel, content with his life, despite the hardships he faced. "I envy that," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Miguel raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "You envy my life?" Aurora nodded, her eyes drifting towards the horizon. It must be nice, not having to worry about what others expect of you. In my world, there are always expectations. Always someone telling me who I should be, what I should do. Miguel frowned slightly, his gaze softening with understanding. That sounds like a heavy burden to carry. It is, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Aurora could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and when she finally turned to look at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache: sympathy, understanding, and something deeper, something more personal. You don't have to carry that burden alone, Miguel said softly, his voice gentle but firm. Aurora's breath caught in her throat. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her, made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. For so long, she had been surrounded by people who only saw her as the heiress, the perfect daughter, the woman who would marry well and continue the family legacy. But Miguel didn't see her that way. He saw her as a person with dreams, fears, and desires of her own. I don't even know why I'm telling you all of this, Aurora said with a nervous laugh, trying to break the tension. We barely know each other. Miguel smiled, a slow, warm smile that made her heart race. Sometimes, it's easier to talk to a stranger. Aurora's heart fluttered at the word stranger. It felt wrong, somehow, to think of Miguel as a stranger. There was a connection between them, something deeper than words could express. She had never felt this way with anyone before, not even the men her parents had paraded in front of her as potential suitors. With Miguel, there was no pretense, no expectations, just two people standing together on the shore, sharing a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. I don't think we're strangers anymore, she said softly, her eyes locking with his. Miguel's expression grew serious, the weight of her words sinking in. No, he agreed, his voice barely a whisper. We're not. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotion, a tension that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. It was as if the world around them had faded away, leaving only the two of them, standing together on the edge of something new and unknown. Before either of them could say anything else, a gust of wind blew through the air, carrying with it the scent of salt and sea. Aurora shivered slightly, and Miguel, ever the gentleman, noticed immediately. You're cold, he said, concern flickering in his eyes. Aurora shook her head. I'm fine. But Miguel was already shrugging off his jacket and draping it over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it sent a jolt of warmth through Aurora's chest. It wasn't just the jacket. It was the thoughtfulness behind it, the way Miguel seemed to care for her in a way that no one else ever had. Thank you, she murmured, pulling the jacket tighter around her. Miguel smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. You don't belong here, he said quietly, his voice laced with something close to regret. Aurora's heart sank. She knew what he meant. She didn't belong in his world, the world of fishermen and simple lives. She belonged in the world of mansions and cocktail parties, of arranged marriages and family legacies. But standing there, with Miguel's jacket around her shoulders and the sound of the ocean in her ears, she couldn't bring herself to care about any of that. Maybe I don't, she said, her voice steady, but right now, I'm exactly where I want to be. Miguel looked at her, really looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. His eyes were dark and intense, filled with emotions he couldn't put into words. And for a moment, just a moment, Aurora thought he might kiss her. But then, as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. Miguel stepped back, his expression unreadable. Aurora sat on the edge of her ornate canopy bed. The silk sheets crumpled beneath her fingers as she gazed out of the tall windows that overlooked the vast, manicured gardens of her family estate. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows over the land. But instead of filling her with peace, it only deepened the sense of restlessness that had been gnawing at her for days. Her mind kept drifting back to Miguel, his face, his voice, the warmth of his jacket around her shoulders. It was a memory she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried to tell herself that it was foolish to think of him. The house was quiet, too quiet, save for the occasional rustling of maids in the corridors. Her parents were out at yet another social event, undoubtedly mingling with the city's elite, discussing business deals and arranging more connections that would further their standing in society. It was a world that had always felt suffocating to Aurora, a world where everything was dictated by status and appearances. Every smile, every word, every movement was carefully curated to fit into the perfect image of wealth and power. For as long as she could remember, her life had been meticulously planned for her. Private tutors, etiquette lessons, charity galas, all to mold her into the ideal daughter of a wealthy family, one who would someday marry well and continue the legacy. But now, for the first time, Aurora felt like she was teetering on the edge of that carefully constructed path. She had met someone outside of the world she knew, someone who made her question everything she had been taught to value. Miguel. His name echoed in her mind, bringing with it a surge of emotions she couldn't quite explain. The fisherman who had looked at her with such sincerity, who had spoken to her like she was just another person, not the daughter of one of the richest families in the city. It was a small thing, but it had meant everything to her. His life, so different from hers, had seemed so real, so authentic. And for once, Aurora had felt like she could breathe. But now, in the confines of her lavish bedroom, that feeling of freedom seemed so distant. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the weight of her family's expectations pressing down harder than ever. How could she possibly entertain the idea of being with Miguel? Her mother would be furious if she even knew what Aurora was thinking. Her father, he would be disappointed, maybe even heartbroken. She was their only daughter, the one they had poured all their hopes and dreams into. To them, Miguel would be nothing more than a poor fisherman, someone entirely unworthy of her time, let alone her affection. And yet, the thought of never seeing him again filled her with a sadness that she couldn't ignore. She had never felt this way about anyone before. The men her parents had introduced her to over the years had all been polished and perfect on the surface. Lawyers, businessmen, heirs to fortunes even larger than her own. But none of them had ever stirred her heart the way Miguel had in just a few fleeting moments. None of them had ever made her feel like she was truly seen. With a sigh, Aurora stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass as she watched the sun sink lower behind the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a brief moment, she imagined what it would be like to be free of all this. To live a simple life by the sea, without the pressure of society's expectations weighing her down. To be with Miguel. But as quickly as the fantasy came, it was gone. She couldn't just walk away from her life, from her family. They had sacrificed so much for her, built a future for her, one that was secure and prosperous. How could she throw all of that away for a man she barely knew? And yet, how could she ignore the pull in her heart, the way it ached for something more than the hollow promises of wealth and status? The following evening, Aurora found herself at a dinner party hosted by one of her father's business associates. It was an opulent affair, the kind that she had attended countless times before. The room was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter, the air heavy with the scent of expensive perfumes and freshly cut flowers. Aurora moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering smiles and nods to the guests who greeted her. But her heart wasn't in it. "Darling, you're looking lovely as always." Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see her mother approaching, a pleased smile on her perfectly made-up face. "Thank you, Mother," Aurora replied, her tone automatic. "I wanted to introduce you to someone," her mother continued, her eyes gleaming with the excitement of someone who had carefully orchestrated a meeting for weeks. "He's a very eligible bachelor. His father owns one of the largest shipping companies in the country. You'll like him, I'm sure." Aurora's stomach tightened. She knew exactly what her mother was doing. It wasn't the first time she had been paraded in front of some wealthy man in the hopes that a match would be made. It was always the same. Her mother's thinly veiled excitement, her father's quiet approval, and Aurora's sense of dread that grew with each introduction. The man in question was already standing by her mother's side. He was tall and handsome, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He extended a hand to Aurora, his grip firm and confident. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Aurora." She forced a smile, shaking his hand. Likewise. As the evening wore on, Aurora found herself sitting beside him at dinner, listening to him drone on about his business ventures and the investments he had made recently. He was exactly the kind of man her parents wanted her to marry. Successful, well-mannered, and with a fortune to match their own. But as he spoke, all Aurora could think about was Miguel. She couldn't help but compare the two men. This one, with his perfectly tailored suit and calculated charm, and Miguel, with his calloused hands and quiet strength. When the man finally paused to take a sip of his wine, he smiled at her in a way that made her skin crawl. "So, Aurora, tell me, what do you do with your time? Surely you must be involved in some charitable work or other noble cause." It was a question she had been asked 100 times before. Aurora could easily have given him the answer he wanted, could have told him about the charity events she attended and the committees she was part of. But tonight, she didn't have the energy to pretend. She didn't care about impressing this man or anyone else in the room. "I like to walk by the beach," she said instead, her voice quiet but firm. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her response. "The beach," he repeated, as if the idea of someone like her finding joy in something so simple was unfathomable. "Yes," she said, her gaze drifting past him to the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. "It's peaceful there. I can think." The man seemed at a loss for words, but before he could respond, Aurora stood abruptly, excusing herself from the table. She couldn't stand to be there any longer, couldn't bear the weight of the expectations pressing down on her from all sides. She needed to get out, to breathe, to feel something real. Without a second thought, she slipped out of the grand dining room and made her way towards the exit. The night air hit her like a cool wave as she stepped outside, and for a moment, she just stood there, letting the breeze wash over her. She had no plan, no destination in mind, but her feet began to move almost of their own accord, carrying her towards the one place where she felt like she could be herself. The beach was quiet when Aurora arrived, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the sand, and as she walked, her thoughts raced. She hadn't meant to come here, not consciously at least, but now that she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards this place, towards the man who had made her feel alive in a way no one else ever had. And then she saw him. Miguel was sitting by his boat, his back to the water as he mended a net, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a moment, Aurora just stood there, watching him, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked so at ease, so content in his simple life. And in that moment, she realized something that terrified her. She wanted to be a part of that life. She wanted to be with him. Gathering her courage, Aurora walked towards him, her footsteps soft in the sand. When she was just a few feet away, Miguel finally looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Aurora," he said, standing quickly, wiping his hands on his shirt. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to come," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. There was a brief silence as they stood there, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Miguel studied her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. Aurora shook her head, and to her horror, she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been holding everything in for so long. The pressure, the expectations, the loneliness. And now, standing here in front of him, it all threatened to spill out. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. Aurora stood on the shore, her feet sinking slightly into the damp sand as the soft rhythm of the waves filled the space between her and Miguel. The salty breeze tugged at her hair, but she paid it no mind. Her heart was pounding in her chest, every beat reverberating through her as she struggled to find the words she had come here to say. The cool night air brushed against her skin, yet her face felt flushed, her emotions threatening to spill over like the tide before her. Miguel looked at her with a mixture of concern and confusion, the net he had been mending forgotten on the ground beside him. His rugged face was illuminated by the pale moonlight, and there was a softness in his eyes that both comforted and unsettled her. He took a hesitant step forward, but stopped just short of closing the distance between them. "Aurora," he began, his voice low and cautious. "What's going on? Why are you here?" Her breath hitched in her throat. Why was she here? She hadn't even realized where she was going until her feet had brought her to the beach, to him. Her mind had been in turmoil ever since the dinner party. Ever since she had sat beside a man her parents deemed suitable and realized how utterly disconnected she felt from the life she had been born into. She had come here without a plan, only the overwhelming need to see Miguel again, to be near him. "I couldn't stay," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stay in that house, with those people. It felt like I was suffocating." Miguel's brow furrowed, his gaze never leaving her face. What happened? Aurora exhaled slowly, trying to gather her thoughts. How could she explain it to him? How could she make him understand the weight of the expectations her family placed on her? The suffocating feeling of living a life that wasn't her own. She had always known that her parents expected her to marry someone from their world. Someone rich, powerful, and well-connected. But the thought of spending her life with a man like that, in a world that revolved around wealth and status, made her feel like she was being buried alive. I feel so trapped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family, they expect so much from me. They want me to marry someone from our circle, someone who can help expand the business, someone who fits into their world. But I don't want that, Miguel. I don't want any of it." Miguel's expression softened, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair away from her face. His touch was warm, grounding, and Aurora felt a flicker of calm amidst the storm raging inside her. "I can't pretend to understand what that's like," he said quietly, "but I can see how much it's hurting you." Aurora looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude for his kindness, his empathy. There was something so genuine about Miguel, something that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. With him, she didn't have to be perfect or poised. She didn't have to be the ideal daughter or the future trophy wife of some wealthy heir. With Miguel, she could just be herself. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm supposed to marry someone like the man I met tonight. He was everything my parents want from me, rich, successful, charming. But I felt nothing, and all I could think about was you." Miguel's eyes widened slightly at her confession, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he took another step closer until they were standing just inches apart. The sound of the waves seemed to fade into the background as the intensity of the moment hung between them, unspoken but palpable. "Aurora," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm just a fisherman. I can't give you the life your family wants for you. I don't have money or status. All I can offer you is myself." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Miguel wasn't the kind of man her parents would ever approve of. He didn't come from wealth or privilege. He lived a simple life, one built on hard work and honesty. But as Aurora stood there, looking into his eyes, she realized that none of that mattered to her. She didn't care about money or status. She cared about him. "I don't want their life," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't care about the money or the parties or the business deals. I just want to be happy. And I don't know if I've ever felt more like myself than when I'm with you." Miguel's breath seemed to catch in his throat, and for a moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other as the weight of her words settled between them. The air was thick with tension, the kind that teetered on the edge of something monumental, something life-changing. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure this is what you want? Because if you choose this, if you choose me, your life will change. It won't be easy." Aurora swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She knew he was right. Choosing Miguel meant turning her back on everything she had ever known. It meant defying her parents, risking their disappointment, their anger. It meant leaving behind a life of comfort and luxury for one of uncertainty and struggle. But as terrifying as that prospect was, the thought of never seeing Miguel again was worse. The thought of living a life without love, without passion, was unbearable. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady now, filled with resolve. "I want this. I want you." For a moment, neither of them moved. They stood there, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the beach, the sound of the waves a distant hum in the background. And then, slowly, Miguel reached out and took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a promise, a vow that whatever came next, they would face it together. "I don't know what's going to happen," Miguel said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "But I swear to you, Aurora, I will never let you regret this." Aurora felt a surge of warmth flood her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. It wasn't the forced, polite smile she had perfected over the years, the one she wore at parties and social events. It was real, genuine, born out of the quiet joy that had settled deep within her heart. "I believe you," she whispered, squeezing his hand. For a moment, they stood in silence, simply holding each other's gaze, the world around them fading away. There was no need for words. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. They had made their choice, and now there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Aurora and Miguel met in secret, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. Every time they saw each other, it became harder for Aurora to return to her life of wealth and privilege, harder to slip back into the role her parents had designed for her. The life she had once known now felt like a prison, and Miguel was her only escape. But as much as Aurora cherished the time she spent with him, she knew that their relationship couldn't remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would find out. And when that happened, there would be consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the beach, Aurora and Miguel sat side by side on the sand, their shoulders touching as they watched the waves roll in and out. Aurora's heart was heavy with the knowledge that their time together was running out. She had to tell her parents. She had to make a choice. "I'm going to tell them," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Miguel turned to look at her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Tell who?" "My parents," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to tell them about us." There was a brief pause as Miguel processed her words. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and intense as they met hers. "Are you sure you want to do that?" Aurora nodded, though her stomach twisted with nerves. "I have to. I can't keep lying to them. And I can't keep living this double life." Miguel was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the horizon as he considered her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I'll stand by you, no matter what." Aurora smiled, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her chest. She knew that Miguel would be by her side. But what about her parents? How would they react when they found out that their only daughter was in love with a fisherman? Would they accept it? Or would they cut her off? Disown her? The confrontation with her parents came sooner than she had anticipated. Aurora hadn't planned on telling them that evening, but when her father had brought up another arranged meeting with the eligible bachelor from the dinner party, the words had tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. "There's someone else," she had said, her voice trembling. Her mother had frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth, while her father had set down his wine glass with a thud, his expression one of shock and confusion. "What do you mean?" "There's someone else," her father had asked, his tone sharp. Aurora had taken a deep breath, her hands trembling in her lap. "I'm in love with someone else. His name is Miguel. He's a fisherman." Her mother had gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been struck. Her father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "A fisherman?" her father had thundered, his voice rising in disbelief. "You're telling me that you've been sneaking around with some lowly fisherman?" Aurora had flinched at the venom in his voice, but she had forced herself to meet his gaze. The tension in the room was suffocating. Aurora sat rigidly in the grand dining room of her family's estate, her heart racing as her parents stared at her in stunned silence. The air was thick with the weight of her confession. Her words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the room like a dark cloud. She had told them. She had finally told them about Miguel, the fisherman who had captured her heart. And now, as she watched the shock and disbelief spread across her father's face, She wondered if she had just destroyed everything she had ever known. Her mother, still clutching her chest, was the first to speak. "Aurora," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you saying? A fisherman? You've been seeing a fisherman? What on earth has gotten into you?" Aurora clenched her hands into fists under the table, trying to steady herself. "I'm saying that I'm in love with him. His name is Miguel, and he's everything I've ever wanted in a man. He's kind, compassionate, hardworking. Her father cut her off, his voice loud and incredulous. "He's a fisherman, Aurora. He doesn't belong in our world. What could he possibly offer you? Do you think love is enough to sustain you? Love doesn't put food on the table or keep you in the lifestyle you're accustomed to." Aurora's stomach twisted at his words, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't care about the lifestyle, Father. I don't care about the money or the fancy parties or the business deals. I care about being happy, and Miguel makes me happy." Her father's eyes flashed with anger, and he slammed his fist down on the table, causing the dishes to rattle. "You're throwing your life away for some fisherman. You have no idea what you're saying, Aurora. You're blinded by infatuation. This is nothing more than a childish rebellion against the life we've given you." Aurora flinched at the outburst, but forced herself to meet his gaze. "This isn't rebellion, Father. This is me choosing the life I want. I've spent my entire life trying to live up to your expectations, but I can't do it anymore. I can't marry someone I don't love just because it fits into your plans for the family business." Her mother let out a soft sob, shaking her head in disbelief. "Aurora, please. You don't know what you're doing. You're young. You don't understand how the world works. You need stability, security." "I understand perfectly well," Aurora interrupted, her voice firm. "I understand that I've been living a life that isn't mine. I've been living a life designed for me, not by me, and I can't keep doing it." Her father rose from his chair, his face a mask of fury. "You will not disgrace this family with your foolishness, Aurora. You will end this affair with that man, or so help me, I will disown you. Do you understand me?" The words hit Aurora like a physical blow, but she stood her ground. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was unshakable. She had known this would be the likely outcome, and as terrifying as the prospect of losing everything was, the thought of living a life without Miguel was even worse. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But I won't end things with Miguel. I love him, and I'm going to be with him, no matter what it costs me." Her father's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her. But instead, he simply stared at her, his eyes cold and hard. "Then you are no longer my daughter," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Pack your things and leave this house. You will not return. From this moment forward, you are nothing to me." The words cut deep, but Aurora didn't let her father see her pain. She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. She had expected this, but it still hurt more than she could have imagined. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the dining room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she ascended the grand staircase for what would likely be the last time, she felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her family, her home, her wealth. But in doing so, she was finally choosing her own path. It didn't take long for Aurora to pack. She didn't have much, just a few clothes, some personal items, and a photo of her family from happier times. As she zipped up her suitcase, a wave of sadness washed over her. She was walking away from the life she had been raised in, but it felt like she was also walking away from the people who had loved her in their own, complicated way. Her mother had come to her door once while she was packing, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Aurora, please," she had begged, her voice raw with emotion. "Don't do this. Don't throw your life away. You don't know what it's like out there. You're not prepared for it. Please, just listen to your father." Aurora had paused, her heart aching at the sight of her mother, so broken and desperate. But she had also known that she couldn't stay, not under the terms her parents had set. "I'm sorry, Mother," she had said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I have to do this. I have to follow my heart." Her mother had cried then, deep, racking sobs that had torn at Aurora's heart. But she hadn't stopped her. She hadn't tried to block the door, or keep her from leaving. She had simply turned and walked away, leaving Aurora alone with her decision. The sun was just beginning to set as Aurora made her way down the long driveway, her suitcase rolling behind her. She didn't know where she would go, didn't know what the future held for her, but she felt a strange sense of peace as she walked away from the estate. She had made her choice, and for the first time in her life, it was her choice. Miguel was waiting for her by the shore, just as he had promised. His face was tense with worry as he watched her approach, but when their eyes met, his expression softened into one of relief and tenderness. "You came," he said softly, stepping forward to take her suitcase from her. "I came," she replied, her voice equally soft. Miguel set the suitcase down and took her hands in his grip firm and warm. "Are you okay?" Aurora nodded, though her throat was tight with emotion. "I will be." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly against his chest. Aurora closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of salt and sea that clung to him. In his arms, she felt safe. In his arms, she knew that everything would be okay, no matter what happened next. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment for Aurora. She had moved in with Miguel into his small, modest home by the sea. It was nothing like the grand estate she had grown up in. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, no servants. But it was warm and cozy, filled with love and laughter. It was a home, not just a house. Miguel worked long hours as a fisherman, rising before dawn and returning late in the afternoon. Aurora often went with him to the docks, helping where she could and learning about his world. It was hard work, grueling, exhausting, and far from glamorous. But it was honest work, and Aurora found a strange sense of fulfillment in it. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the water. They would talk about their hopes, their dreams, their fears. Miguel would listen patiently as Aurora shared stories of her past, the life she had left behind. And in turn, he would tell her about his own dreams. Small, simple dreams of building a life together, of starting a family, of growing old by the sea. It wasn't the life Aurora had once imagined for herself, but it was the life she had chosen. And with each passing day, she grew more certain that it was the right choice. But even as Aurora settled into her new life, the shadow of her family's disapproval loomed over her. She hadn't spoken to her parents since the night she had left. They hadn't called, and neither had she. Part of her wanted to reach out to try to mend the broken ties between them, but she knew that as long as she was with Miguel, her father would never accept her back into the family. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Miguel could sense the sadness that weighed on her. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. "Do you regret leaving them?" Aurora sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I miss them," she admitted. "I miss my mother, even my father, despite everything. But I don't regret my choice. I could never regret choosing you." Miguel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I'm sorry that you had to give up so much for me." Aurora shook her head. "I didn't give up anything. I gained everything that matters." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Aurora knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that there would be moments of doubt, of longing for the life she had left behind. But she also knew that as long as she had Miguel, she would be okay. She had chosen love over everything else. And in that choice, she had found herself. The first hints of autumn settled on the coastal town like a cool, salty breeze, signaling a change in the air. Aurora had become well acquainted with the rhythms of life by the sea. Early mornings that began with the crisp sound of fishing boats heading out, afternoons spent mending nets, and long evenings where the sky blazed in hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped into the horizon. It was far removed from the life she had once known, but it had become hers. Yet, beneath the surface, the storm brewing inside her was growing harder to ignore. Though she had made peace with her decision to leave her family and follow her heart, Aurora couldn't shake the lingering ache that clung to her like the scent of the sea. She hadn't spoken to her parents since the night she had walked out of their lives. No messages, no letters, no acknowledgement of her existence. The distance between them was palpable, and with each passing day, she felt the weight of their absence more acutely. Aurora missed the soft sound of her mother's voice calling her for breakfast, the laughter she used to share with her childhood friends in the sprawling gardens of their estate, even the stern lectures from her father about duty and responsibility. She missed the life she had known, but more than that, she missed the people in it. Miguel sensed the change in her mood long before she had the courage to speak of it. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the waves lap gently against the shore, he finally broke the silence. "You're not happy, Aurora," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking the concern in his tone. Aurora blinked, startled by his words. "What do you mean?" "Of course, I'm happy." Miguel turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "I see it in your eyes. There's a sadness there, a weight. You've been carrying it for weeks." Aurora looked away, her heart heavy. She hadn't realized how transparent her emotions had become. She thought she had hidden her pain well, but Miguel saw through her as if she were made of glass. "It's just," she began, her voice trailing off as she struggled to find the words. "I miss them, my family. I thought that after I left, it would get easier, that I'd feel free. But instead, it feels like a part of me is missing." Miguel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand," he said quietly. "It's only natural to miss them. They're your family, Aurora. No matter what's happened between you, they'll always be a part of you." Aurora nodded, but the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "But what if they never forgive me? What if I'm never welcome back?" Miguel pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed quietly into his chest. "You didn't do anything wrong," he murmured into her hair. "You followed your heart. You chose love, and that's never something to be ashamed of. But if you feel that you need to try and make peace with them, I'll support you, whatever you decide." Aurora buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of salt and sea. His warmth enveloped her, grounding her in the present, but her thoughts drifted back to her parents. She had been so sure of her decision when she left, but now she wasn't certain if her father's love was something she could afford to lose forever. The following days were a blur of conflicting emotions. Aurora threw herself into the tasks at hand, trying to keep her mind occupied. She helped Miguel with his daily fishing expeditions, learned to cook with the fresh catch they brought in, and spent hours walking along the shore, finding solace in the soothing crash of the waves. But the quiet moments of the evening, when the world seemed to still around them, or when the ache in her chest became unbearable. She thought about her father's face, red with anger and disappointment, his harsh words echoing in her ears. "You are no longer my daughter." Miguel, ever intuitive, could sense when the weight of it all became too much for her. One evening, as they sat by the fire Miguel had built to ward off the autumn chill, he brought up something she had been avoiding for weeks. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Maybe it's time you talk to them." Aurora stared into the flames, watching as they danced and flickered in the cool night air. "Talk to them? How could I? They disowned me, Miguel. My father said I was nothing to him. But he's still your father," Miguel countered gently. "And your mother. I know she must be hurting just as much as you are. Sometimes it takes time for people to come around. Maybe they just need to hear from you." Aurora bit her lip, her heart torn. The idea of reaching out to her parents terrified her. What if they rejected her all over again? What if the damage was too great to repair? But Miguel was right. She couldn't live in limbo forever. If there was even a chance of mending the rift between her and her family, she had to try. The next morning, Aurora sat at the small wooden table in their modest kitchen, a pen in her hand and a blank sheet of paper before her. She had been staring at it for nearly an hour, trying to find the right words to say. What could she possibly write that would make a difference? How could she explain her choices without reopening old wounds? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she began to write. "Dear Mother and Father, I know it's been a long time since you've heard from me, and I'm sure that my silence has caused you pain. I've been struggling with what to say, and I hope you'll understand that I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to choose between my love for you and my love for Miguel, but that's what it felt like I had to do. I know you don't approve of the life I've chosen, and I understand why. You've always wanted the best for me, and I respect that. But I also hope that one day, you'll be able to see that I've found happiness in this life. Miguel may not be the man you envisioned for me, but he's kind, hardworking, and he loves me with all his heart. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for things to go back to the way they were. I just want you to know that I miss you both terribly. I miss our family, and I hope that in time, we can find a way to reconnect. Please know that I love you and that I think of you every day. Your daughter, Aurora. She stared at the letter for a long time after she finished, her heart heavy with the weight of the words she had written. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was all she could offer. Days passed, and the letter remained on the kitchen table, unsent. Aurora found herself unable to take the final step of mailing it. The fear of rejection gnawed at her, and every time she thought about sending it, her heart would race with anxiety. But one evening, as they sat together by the fire once again, Miguel reached over and took her hand. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" he asked softly, his dark eyes full of understanding. Aurora swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't know if I can, Miguel. What if they don't want to hear from me? What if they've already moved on?" Miguel squeezed her hand gently. "You won't know unless you try." Aurora nodded slowly, her eyes locked on the flames. She knew he was right. She couldn't live in fear of what might happen. She had to take the leap, no matter how terrifying it felt. The next morning, with Miguel by her side, Aurora walked to the small post office in town. Her heart pounded in her chest as she handed the letter to the clerk, her fingers trembling slightly as she released it. As the letter disappeared from her sight, a strange sense of relief washed over her. She had done it. She had reached out. Now, all she could do was wait. The days that followed were some of the longest of Aurora's life. Every time the mail arrived, her heart would leap with anticipation, only to sink when there was nothing from her parents. She tried to distract herself with work, with Miguel, with the beauty of the sea that surrounded her, but the anxiety gnawed at her constantly. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Miguel noticed her unease and wrapped his arm around her. "They'll write back," he said softly, his voice full of quiet confidence. "Give them time." Aurora nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. But deep down, she wasn't sure if he was right. What if her letter had only made things worse? What if they had read it and tossed it aside, determined to forget her? But then, one late afternoon, as she was returning from the market, she saw Miguel standing by the front door, holding an envelope in his hand. His eyes met hers, and without a word, he held it out to her. Aurora's heart nearly stopped as she took the envelope from him, her hands trembling. The return address was unmistakable. It was from her parents. For a moment, she simply stared at it, unable to breathe. Then, with Miguel standing by her side, she carefully opened the letter. The words inside were simple, but they brought tears to her eyes. "We miss you too." As the weeks passed, Aurora continued to exchange letters with her parents, each one slowly chipping away at the wall that had been built between them. It wasn't easy. There were still wounds to heal, still things left unsaid. But for the first time since she had left, Aurora felt a glimmer of hope. And through it all, Miguel was there, her constant source of strength and love. Together, they faced the uncertainties of the future, knowing that whatever came their way, they would face it together. Aurora had chosen love, and in the end, it had brought her back to where she belonged. Not just by the sea, but in the hearts of the people she loved. The coastal town had become Aurora's sanctuary, a place where she had found both peace and turmoil, joy and heartbreak. The crashing waves had been her solace, the salty wind her reminder of freedom. But as autumn deepened, and the first chill of winter threatened to roll in, the same landscape that had once soothed her now filled her with an undercurrent of tension. The reason was simple: her family. Since receiving the simple letter from her parents with those 3 weighty words, "We miss you too," Aurora had been torn between relief and uncertainty. Those words, scrawled in her mother's familiar handwriting, were a fragile olive branch, signaling that while the rift had not healed completely, it was no longer as wide as it once seemed. But it left so many unanswered questions. Would they ever accept Miguel? Could they understand the life she had chosen? Were they merely extending this peace out of a sense of familial obligation, or did they genuinely want her back in their lives? The days passed slowly as she grappled with these thoughts, but despite her inner turmoil, life in the small fishing village continued its rhythm. Aurora had gradually found her place in this new world, becoming part of the fabric of the community in ways she hadn't imagined. She helped Miguel repair his nets, learned how to barter with the local vendors, and even started a small vegetable garden behind their modest house. Her hands, once soft from a life of privilege, were now calloused but stronger for it. Still, the weight of the unanswered questions gnawed at her, especially at night when the world was quiet and all she could hear was the roar of the ocean and her own thoughts. Miguel, ever perceptive, sensed her unrest even when she tried to hide it. One evening, as they sat in front of the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room, he spoke softly. "You've been quiet these past few days," he observed, turning to her with a look of concern. "Is it the letters?" Aurora nodded, sighing as she leaned back against the cushions, drawing her knees up to her chest. "Yes, I thought that hearing from them again would give me some peace, but it's only made me more confused." Miguel reached for her hand, gently squeezing it. "What do you mean?" Aurora hesitated, trying to put her emotions into words. "I don't know where we stand. They said they miss me, but what does that really mean? Do they want me back in their lives? Do they want to reconcile? Or are they just being polite?" Miguel's thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "The fact that they reached out at all is a good sign. But you're right. You can't know what they really mean unless you talk to them. Face to face." Aurora swallowed hard, her heart pounding at the thought. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Miguel smiled gently, his voice full of understanding. "No one is ever fully ready for these things. But I think it's the only way you'll get the answers you're looking for." Aurora knew he was right. She had been hiding behind letters for too long, afraid of the confrontation that would inevitably come with seeing her parents again. But if she truly wanted closure, whether that meant reconciliation or finally accepting that she and her family would never fully understand each other, she had to take that step. The decision to return home, even if only for a short visit, filled Aurora with both anticipation and dread. The house she had once called home now felt like a distant memory, and the idea of stepping back into that world, a world she had deliberately left behind, made her stomach twist with anxiety. Yet, as she packed a small bag for the journey, she realized that she wasn't the same person who had walked out of her parents' lives months ago. She was stronger now, more sure of herself and her choices. She had built a life with Miguel, a life full of love and purpose, even if it wasn't the life her family had envisioned for her. Miguel watched her pack with quiet support, offering his usual reassuring smile when their eyes met. "I'll be here when you get back," he said simply, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. Aurora's heart swelled with gratitude. She wasn't doing this alone. She had Miguel, and no matter what happened with her family, she would always have him to come back to. The journey back to the city felt surreal, as if Aurora were traveling back in time. The closer the bus got to the sprawling estates and towering buildings that defined her former life, the more her nerves began to fray. She hadn't told her parents she was coming. Part of her feared that if she had, they might have discouraged her. She needed this visit to be on her terms. The gates of her childhood home loomed ahead as the car pulled into the long driveway. The house, with its sprawling gardens and pristine white columns, looked exactly as she remembered. But as she stepped out of the vehicle and took in the familiar surroundings, she realized that she was the one who had changed. Her heart pounded as she approached the front door, her hands shaking slightly as she raised her fist to knock. But before she could, the door swung open, revealing her mother standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Aurora's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of her mother, still beautiful, still poised, but with a slight weariness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Aurora," her mother whispered, her voice catching. Aurora swallowed hard, tears already pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Mom." Without another word, her mother stepped forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. Aurora hadn't realized how much she had missed this. The warmth, the familiarity, the sense of belonging. Her mother's arms were as comforting as they had always been, and for a brief moment, Aurora allowed herself to simply be her daughter again. "I'm so glad you're here," her mother said softly, pulling back to look at her. "We've missed you so much." Aurora nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "I've missed you too." Her mother ushered her inside, and as Aurora stepped into the grand foyer, memories flooded back. The elegant staircase, the gleaming marble floors, the chandeliers that sparkled in the soft afternoon light, it all felt so familiar, yet so distant at the same time. Her father was waiting in the living room, standing stiffly by the fireplace. Aurora's heart clenched at the sight of him. His face was unreadable, his expression carefully controlled, but there was something in his eyes, a softness, a hesitation, that gave her hope. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her fully, his gaze sweeping over her as if he were seeing her for the first time. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension in the room thick and palpable. "I didn't think you'd ever come back," he finally said, his voice low. Aurora swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I wasn't sure if I would either." Her father's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Aurora thought he might walk away. But then he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," he said, the words so quiet she almost didn't hear them. Aurora blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" Her father sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm sorry for what I said that night. I was angry. I was scared. I thought I was losing you, and I didn't know how to handle it." Tears welled in Aurora's eyes as she stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You didn't lose me, Dad. I'm still here. I needed to find my own way." Her father nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sadness. "I know, and I should have supported you, but instead, I pushed you away. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was hurt you." Aurora took a deep, shaky breath, her heart swelling with emotion. This was the conversation she had been dreading and longing for. The moment where they could finally begin to heal the wounds that had festered between them for so long. "I forgive you," she said softly, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. For a moment, her father stood still, as if unsure of how to respond. But then, slowly, he returned the embrace, his arms wrapping around her tightly, as if he were afraid to let her go again. The hours that followed were filled with quiet conversations and long overdue apologies. Aurora's mother sat beside her on the couch, holding her hand as they talked about everything they had missed in each other's lives. Her father, though still reserved, joined in the conversation, offering his own words of regret and love. It wasn't perfect. There were still things left unsaid, still lingering tensions that would take time to fully resolve. But it was a start, and as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light through the windows, Aurora felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Her parents hadn't fully accepted her choices, and she knew that there would be challenges ahead. But they had opened the door to reconciliation, and for that, she was grateful. When Aurora returned to the small coastal town, Miguel was waiting for her at the dock, his boat tied up and ready for the evening's fishing trip. As she stepped off the bus and into his waiting arms, she felt a deep sense of relief. She had faced her past, and now she could fully embrace her future. "How did it go?" Miguel asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Aurora smiled, leaning into his touch. "It went better than I expected. There's still a lot to work through, but we're getting there." Miguel kissed her forehead, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "I'm proud of you." Aurora looked up at him, her heart full of love and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Together, they walked hand in hand along the shoreline, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks a comforting backdrop to their quiet conversation. Aurora had made peace with her past, and now, with Miguel by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Aurora realized that she had finally found her place in the world, not in the grand house she had grown up in, but here, by the sea, with the man she loved and the life she had chosen. Wherever she went, wherever life took her, she knew one thing for certain. She was home. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.